If you could stand in the streets of Paris on the morning of July 14, 1789, you would have smelled two things: gunpowder and fear. When the mob finally breached the walls of the Bastille, history tells us they were looking for weapons to defend themselves against the king's army. They were fighting for liberty, equality, and fraternity. That is the story we are taught in school. It is the romantic version, but there is a darker, more pragmatic truth buried beneath the cobblestones. Those men and women didn't just storm a prison because they were inspired by the philosophy of the Enlightenment. They stormed it because they were hungry, and they were hungry because the most sophisticated financial machine in Europe had completely broken down. The French Revolution was not sparked by a speech. It was sparked by a ledger. It was a catastrophe of bad accounting, reckless borrowing, and a central bank system that treated money like magic rather than math. And if you look closely at the economic ruin that brought down the French monarchy, you start to see a terrifying reflection of our own modern financial world. So, let's look past the guillotine and the glory for a moment. Let's talk about the money, because that is where the real revolution happened. To understand how France collapsed, we have to understand what it looked like before the fall. In the mid-18th century, France wasn't just a country, it was the superpower of Europe. It had the largest population, the strongest army, and the most fertile land. Versailles was the envy of the world, a golden cage where the aristocracy lived in a perpetual state of party. But this projection of infinite wealth was a lie. The French financial system was a rotting structure painted gold. Unlike Britain, which had modernized its economy with the Bank of England and a transparent system of public debt, France was stuck in the medieval ages. The king didn't even collect his own taxes. Instead, the crown relied on a system known as tax farming. The government would sell the rights to collect taxes to private individuals, wealthy financiers who would pay the king a lump sum up front. In exchange, these farmers were given free rein to go out into the countryside and shake down the peasantry for every sou they had. Whatever they collected above what they paid the king, they kept. Imagine the IRS was a private, for-profit mercenary group that could legally threaten you until you paid up, and then pocket the difference. That was the reality for the French peasant. It was a system designed to breed resentment. It bled the working class dry, while the profits flowed into the pockets of a few well-connected elites, bypassing the national treasury entirely. However, corruption alone doesn't destroy a superpower. It takes a catalyst. For France, that catalyst was war. Throughout the 1700s, France and Britain were locked in a global contest for dominance. But wars are expensive. Incredibly expensive. France fought in the War of the Austrian Succession, then the 7 Years' War, losing vast territories and treasure in both. But the final nail in the coffin was, ironically, a victory. When the American colonies decided to rebel against the British Empire in 1776, King Louis XI saw a golden opportunity. He could humiliate his old rival, Britain, by funding the Americans. It worked. The United States won its independence. But for France, the cost was fatal. The French crown borrowed over 1 billion livres to fund the American Revolution. To put that number in perspective, by the 1780s, the interest payments on the national debt alone were consuming more than 50% of the king's annual revenue. Think about that math. For every dollar the government brought in, 50 cents went immediately to paying off old debts. That left only 50 cents to pay for the army, the navy, the palaces, the roads, and the entire administration of the state. The country was running on fumes, borrowing new money, just to pay off the interest on the old money. It was a Ponzi scheme disguised as a government. While the bankers in Paris were sweating over balance sheets, the reality on the ground was becoming a nightmare. France's tax code was a masterclass in unfairness. The two wealthiest groups in the country, the clergy, the first estate, and the nobility, the second estate, were almost entirely exempt from paying taxes. They owned most of the land and held all the power, yet they contributed nothing to the treasury. The entire burden fell on the third estate, the commoners, the merchants, and the peasants. This fragility turned catastrophic in 1788. A series of brutal hailstorms and droughts destroyed the grain harvest. In 18th century France, bread wasn't just a food item, it was the primary fuel source for the human body. The average worker ate huge amounts of bread daily. It was 90% of their diet. As grain supplies vanished, prices skyrocketed. In a matter of months, the price of a loaf of bread rose to consume 80% to 90% of a laborer's daily wage. Imagine working a 12-hour shift, and at the end of the day, your entire paycheck buys you nothing but a single loaf of bread to split among your family. You have nothing left for rent, for clothes, for fuel. Hunger does something to the human psyche. It strips away patience. It removes the fear of authority. When a father watches his children starve, while he knows the granaries at Versailles are full, he stops caring about the divine right of kings. The riots that broke out in Paris weren't originally about democracy. They were bread riots. King Louis XVI wasn't an evil man, but he was indecisive. He knew the system was broken. He appointed brilliant economists like Anne Robert Jacques Turgot, and later Jacques Necker to fix the mess. Turgot looked at the books and told the king the hard truth. No more borrowing. No more tax exemptions for the rich. We need austerity. The nobility revolted. They refused to give up their privileges. They whispered in the king's ear that Turgot was a radical, a threat to the natural order. Weak-willed, Louis fired Turgot. By 1789, the credit markets had shut the door. No banker in Europe would lend the French king another dime. The treasury was empty. Desperate, Louis XVI summoned the Estates General, a legislative assembly that hadn't met in 150 years, hoping they would approve new taxes. Instead, they realized the game was rigged. The Third Estate broke away, formed the National Assembly, and swore to create a constitution. The king panicked and surrounded Paris with troops. The people, fearing a massacre and driven by that gnawing hunger, stormed the Bastille. The dam had broken. Here is where the story gets truly interesting from an economic perspective. The monarchy fell, but the debt remained. The new revolutionary government, the National Assembly, inherited a bankrupt nation. They had eliminated the king, but they hadn't eliminated the deficit. They needed money, and they needed it fast. They looked around and saw the massive land holdings of the Catholic Church, about 10% of all land in France. In a bold move, they nationalized this land. They then had a brilliant idea. They would issue a new paper currency called the Assignat. These weren't just paper notes. They were bonds backed by the value of that confiscated church land. The theory was sound. If you held an Assignat, you effectively owned a piece of French soil. It was supposed to be a stable, land-backed currency that would pay off the national debt and jumpstart the economy. At first, it worked. The economy stabilized, trade resumed, people felt a surge of optimism. But politicians, whether they are monarchists or revolutionaries, share a common fatal flaw. They cannot resist the printing press. The government ran out of money again. So, they looked at the assignats and thought, why not print a few more? They promised they would burn the old notes as they came back in, keeping the supply limited. They lied. Once the taboo of printing money was broken, there was no stopping it. They printed millions, then billions. The link between the paper money and the land was severed. The law of supply and demand took over with brutal efficiency. The more assignats flooded the streets, the less they were worth. By 1793, France was in the grip of the first modern hyperinflationary crisis. Prices didn't just double, they spiraled out of control. A pair of shoes that cost 5 livres one year cost 200 livres the next. The social fabric tore apart. Farmers refused to sell their grain for worthless paper money. They hoarded food, preferring to let it rot than trade it for confetti. Shopkeepers closed their doors. The urban poor were once again starving, but this time, they had pockets full of money that couldn't buy anything. The revolutionary government, now led by the radical Jacobins and Robespierre, responded not with economic reform, but with terror. They passed the law of the maximum, creating strict price controls on goods. They said, you must sell bread at this price, or else. When the market didn't obey, they used the guillotine. Merchants accused of hoarding were executed. Bakers who priced their bread too high were beheaded. The government tried to fight inflation with the executioner's blade. It turned the economy into a graveyard. Commerce stopped entirely because doing business became a death sentence. The assignat became a symbol of the revolution's failure, a promise of wealth that had turned into poverty and blood. By 1795, the system had collapsed. The assignat was totally worthless. The people were exhausted. They had killed their king, destroyed the church, and waged war on half of Europe. Yet they were poorer than when they started. History teaches us a painful lesson here. When a society is forced to choose between freedom and eating, they will choose eating every single time. Chaos creates a vacuum, and into that vacuum steps the strongman. Enter Napoleon Bonaparte. We remember Napoleon for his battles, Austerlitz, Marengo, Waterloo, but his greatest victory was arguably financial. When he seized power in 1799, he understood what the revolutionaries did not. You cannot build a state on funny money. Napoleon abolished the worthless paper currencies. He established the Bank of France, creating a centralized, professional institution to manage the money supply. He insisted that the new currency, the franc, be pegged to gold and silver. He brought hard money back. Almost overnight, inflation vanished. Stability returned. Merchants opened their shops. Farmers brought their grain to market, and the army was paid in coin that actually held value. Napoleon became emperor, not just because he was a conqueror, but because he was a stabilizer. He traded liberty for solvency, and after 10 years of chaos, France took the deal. So, why does this story matter today? Because the mechanics of the French collapse are not unique to the 18th century. They are the universal laws of economics. We see the same patterns repeating over and over again. We saw it in Weimar Germany in the 1920s, where people brought wheelbarrows of cash to buy bread. We saw it in Zimbabwe and Venezuela. And if we are honest, we see uncomfortable parallels in the global economy today. Governments around the world are carrying record levels of debt. Central banks have spent the last decade printing trillions of dollars, euros, and yen to keep the system afloat. We call it quantitative easing or liquidity injections. But the mechanism is not so different from the Assignats. We are borrowing from the future to pay for the present, hoping that the growth will outpace the debt. The French Revolution serves as a reminder that financial systems are fragile. They rely on trust. When a government breaks that trust, whether through unfair taxation, reckless spending, or debasing the currency, the consequences are not just lines on a graph. The consequences are social unrest, the collapse of institutions, and the rise of extremism. The mob didn't storm the Bastille because they hated the concept of monarchy. They stormed it because the system had failed them. The guillotine was the final receipt for a bill that had been unpaid for decades. History doesn't always repeat itself, but it certainly rhymes. And as we look at our own mounting debts and inflationary pressures, we would do well to listen to the warning echoing from the streets of 1789 Paris. Mathematics has no politics, and eventually the ledger always balances itself.
Absolute compliance.
Yes, execute the orders.